Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Megan Doherty, Director of the Museum of the White Mountains. And as we gather today, we're all on Indigenous lands. For those of you joining us from home, I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous presence in your area, both past and present. Those of us at the Museum of the White Mountains are on Indakina, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki, Penobscot, and Wabanaki peoples. We're grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. And for those of you on Zoom, we'll put a link in the chat where you can learn more about the Indigenous histories of your place at native-land.ca, as well as the Abenaki peoples of Northern New England through the Musée des Abenaki in Quebec. As part of my research for an exhibition this winter, I've been learning about efforts to preserve the culturally important brown ash tree, which is under threat from the emerald ash borer. While our focus tonight will be on fisheries management and preservation, I want to share a tiny bit about two projects that are looking for more folks to get involved in their work. The first is based at UMaine Orono. It's the Ash Protection Collaboration Across Wabanaki, or APCAW. And they're working with tribal nations to build a seed bank for brown ash. And the other is the Monitoring and Managing Ash Project out of the Ecological Research Institute in Kingston, New York. And they're studying lingering ash as potentially emerald ash borer resistant trees offer great hope for conserving the species. Both projects have many ways for volunteers to get involved. For those of you on Zoom, we've put the links in the chat, and I'd be happy to talk more with folks here in person if you're interested in getting involved. For the second lecture in our Spotlight on the Humanities and Sustainability Studies series, I'm delighted we could partner with the Pemi chapter of Trout Unlimited to bring Dan McCaw to campus. We're grateful to their support as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities. Dan McCaw was raised in Burnham, Maine, and attended the University of Maine in Orono, and worked as a fish biologist from 2001 to 2010 with the Maine Atlantic Salmon Commission and the Maine Department of Marine Resources. Since 2011, Dan has worked for the Penobscot Indian Nation's Department of Natural Resources and worked cooperatively with state, federal, and NGO partners to protect, conserve, and restore the Penobscot River's migratory and resident fish species and the ecosystems on which they depend. So please join me in welcoming Dan.
All right. So yeah, anyone else here from Burnham, Maine? Probably not. It's all right. As I drove here today, I live in the city of Gardner now, which is in the center of the state of Maine, right below the state capital of Augusta on the banks of the Kennebec River. And as I drove here today, sort of cutting across country because there's no highway that brings you here, and I'm thankful for that, I was reminded how lovely New Hampshire is, how lovely southwestern Maine is, and how it really all blends together. And of course, the border it's just a line, right? It doesn't really mean anything. It's sort of like the border between northern Maine and Canada, or the border between Texas and Mexico. It doesn't mean anything. It was just drawn on the map by rich white folks back in the day, right? So I am irreverent. I am going to give you a lot of narrative today. I like to speak just for a moment about the idea of narrative, and then I'll jump into a lot of good stuff here. Truth exists, facts exist, right? But how we interpret them and how we express them and what we specifically express or do not express leads to narrative, right? Exclusionary detailing, whitewashing, all these kinds of things that we see. Now, I'm not going to get political in any way, shape, or form. I don't want to influence anyone's thoughts on the political system here in what they call New England. Now, there's nothing new about it, and it's not England. Okay, let's be straight about that. Let's be really honest about that. Indigenous people have been here since the Laurentian ice sheet receded 12,000 years ago, okay? None of them were English or Dutch or French. But I'm going to speak to you based on facts, based on my personal experience, and I'm going to give you my narrative. It may be true most of the time, but at the same time, you have to understand that I'm giving you my opinion. Now, I'm trying to do my best as a fish biologist, as someone who studied zoology at the university, someone who took every fish class I could get, someone who grew up on the banks of a river, someone who spent their summers as a child playing in the river because it was much more interesting to me than the the big woods that existed behind my parents' house. The river was this fascinating thing. And when I was young, one of the guys who lived next door to us, who was a teenager at that point in time, had a snorkel and a mask. And that changed everything for me. Like, how do these animals live in this drainage ditch? Like, how do they do that? Like, and it was rich. And this was at a time when the river was very dirty. We had 2 tanneries upstream and industrial pollution, and there'd be these rafts of pink and red and green foam that would come down the river in certain times of year, certain times of flows, because it wasn't being treated effectively upstream. That doesn't exist now, thankfully, in my lovely Penobscot River. It's the site of the greatest alewife restoration project in the world, period. I invite you to look it up, Penobscot River alewives. It's wonderful. But that's where I come from. That's who I am. Okay, I can't take that out of me, and I can't stop it. I also am a middle child. I'm 5 out of 6 in my family, so I love attention. I've been begging for it my whole life. If you didn't get fed. So you'll have to excuse me all my faults. But like Julia Child would say, you should look her up too. She's great. Don't make excuses for the dinner before you serve it. Okay, so let's jump right into it. I work for the Penobscot Indian Nation. I'd like to thank the Penobscot Nation elders, past, present, and future, who allow me to represent them and who continue to share their homeland with me in the state of Maine, what is called the state of Maine today. A few years ago, the Penobscot River had this big restoration project, right, where they removed 2 of the mainstem dams. The Penobscot River is the biggest river that sits within the bounds of the current state of Maine. So it's the biggest river in my area. It's not as big as the Connecticut, but it is a big river. And so this sort of became internationally famous. We're going to talk about all of those things. But what I want to talk about is challenges to the river first, like what happened, give you a bit of tribal history, and then move through time and think about all the problems that happened originally to the river and to the landscape, move through the idea of the Penobscot River Restoration Project, what happened 10 years ago, really, and then where we are today. And because I'm a one-man shop for the Penobscot Indian Nation, that means I do everything. That means I do field work, although not much anymore, which is very sad. But I am the liaison to the federal, state agencies, all the conservation groups and that sort of thing. And I also work in the FERC world. We're going to come back to that, the idea of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So that's the agency at the federal level that licenses hydro dams to exist and gives them their marching orders on how they need to run their project. So I'm hoping that when we get close to, oh God, it's already 10 past. I don't know what happened.
We started 5 minutes late.
All right. When we get like 10 minutes, 15 minutes before, like, we're going to stop, I want to stop so we can talk, right? So we can have question and answers about all these things, because a lot of what I'm going to say may not make any sense to you, but I've been immersed in it my entire adult life for the most part. Off to a bad start. Sorry, Megan, I broke it.
No, I think it's this is like China.
Hey, okay. This is a young Indigenous woman, girl, on the banks of her tribe's river, Northern California. That's the Trinity River in the background. The Trinity River is a tributary of the Klamath River. Now, if you've been watching the news, the Klamath is about to have 3 major dams removed. The Trinity is lucky because it comes in downstream of those dams. The Hoopa tribe, and this was taken in Hoopa Valley. I took this picture. It was one of the best days of my career as a fisheries biologist. Well, when you get to travel in Northern California on the company's dime, it's a wonderful thing. But the reason I went there was to meet with their fisheries director, Mike Orcutt, who leads fisheries department for the Hoopa tribe. Hoopa, very different from the tribes in Maine or here, is in a tiny little valley. So the touch of colonial man reached there very, very, very late. And when it did, it reached very lightly. So the Hoopa Valley, even though it was modernized and all these kinds of things, it didn't experience the sort of the mass genocide that the tribes on this side of the Mississippi experienced. This fish was taken, you can see the marks on its back, it was taken with a gill net, part of their tribal indigenous fisheries. This young woman gets to eat fish from her indigenous river. I have never met a tribal person in Maine who has ever done that, ever, in modern time, ever. It just doesn't happen. So that's why this picture is so important. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to read this, but you can if you want. I'm going to paraphrase it. So in Penobscot mythology, there's a character called Gluskabe. Gluskabe is a magical person. Gluskabe is also very young and naive. He is the fool, right? So through Gluskabe, we learn lessons, or tribal people, Penobscot people learn lessons. And Gluskabe learned most of his lessons through his grandmother Woodchuck. She was very wise, very old. So Gluskabe traps all the fish. So what happens? Grandma Woodchuck is out by the river trying to catch her fish for her food, to live. She's having a really hard time. So Gluskabe says, well, we're going to make this easy, right? He goes out and builds this massive dam across the river with a little hole in the middle, and then screams to the ocean is going to dry up. Now remember, he's a magical person, magical being, so he can do these kinds of things. The ocean is going to dry up, but if you come into the river, you'll all be saved. So the fish from all across the ocean come in up the river, and then he blocks them and traps them in. And being very proud of himself, he goes to his grandma and says, hey, grandma, look what I did. And she's horrified. No, you've got to let them go. It's perfectly normal that I have to work to catch my fish. We do not take now. We do not make this easy for ourselves. We have to think 7 generations out. Like, what would we leave for the 7th generation out? So she instructs him to go back and remove that dam and let all the fish go. And me, as a fish biologist who have read 25 fisheries management plans, it is the best fisheries management plan I ever read. It's so simple. Leave them alone. Leave them alone. Let them come and go as they want. They're not a resource. They're living things. Okay, so what happened up in Maine? Well, it happened here. We were just at what was the name of the restaurant?
Oh, man.
Right, the Common Man. There's pictures of this all over the wall. Okay, so what did the English and French folks love when they got here? The trees. They were untouched, virgin forests. So there's a river under there somewhere. So what happened? The rivers were straightened. The rivers were bulldozed. The rivers were clogged with debris. The rivers were eventually dynamited to allow, with one goal in mind, to get the trees from upstream to the upland areas down to where the sawmills were. At one point in time, Bangor, Maine was the lumber capital of the world, in that they shipped out more board feet out of Bangor, just pre-Civil War era, than any other place, any other town in the entire world. It's a lot of trees coming down through the Penobscot River. That's the Penobscot River. This is pulpwood stacked up in a lake. This is later in the era when they wasn't full logs, but they were cutting things in 4 foot to be ground up for pulp. And they would boom them across lakes. The picture is so grainy, but believe me, there's water underneath that, and all that is floating wood. Then what else do we do to our rivers here? And of course, up and down the East Coast and all over the world. We put dams in them. This is what they call Old Town Falls. There's a different tribal name for it. I haven't found it yet, but I'm sure it's much better than Old Town Falls. You see the ledge in the center. People love to build dams on ledge. Of course, it's easy to pin them in. They don't go anywhere. And the ledge is a natural break where the water would pitch very quickly. So it's easy to impound water behind it. This dam, this is the Milford Dam, the first dam on the Penobscot River, was originally built to electrify a trolley system that ran trolley cars from Old Town down to the big city of Bangor. It now is owned by a foreign company that pumps money and electricity into the grid for all of us. I see this when I go to my office all the time. This picture was taken and posted on the web, like, look how beautiful it is. I feel very differently. This is the West Branch of the Penobscot. This is one of those cool old photographs where you take that weird kind of viewer and look on it, and it would be like 3D. This is one of the gorges in the West Branch of the Penobscot. This has been underwater for 110 years. No one has seen this forever and ever and ever, because it was flooded out by a dam or a series of dams. We go down to the bottom quote. In 1903, Maine legislature gave control to the West Branch of the Penobscot River, above Shad Pond, which is really at the end of the West Branch, to GNP subsidiary West Branch Rising and Reservoir Dam Company, GNP, Great Northern Paper. They probably were in this state too. The state of Maine gave the West Branch to Great Northern Paper to do whatever they wanted. And what did they want to do? They wanted to compete on the international stage. So they built 5, 6, 7 dams, hydro dams, to create electricity that was not pumped into the grid, but directly to their mills. Now they had control of the forest, they had control of the river, they had control of their own electricity. Great Northern Paper was one of the biggest companies internationally selling newsprint from the 20s through the 60s. Of course, the newspaper is not what it was today that it was back then, but they were feeding everyone their lunch back in those days. And I've heard stories of the lavish picnics that they would throw. Millinocket, which is where this all happened, where these mills were, was called the Golden City in the Woods because it was nothing. It was a crossroads for fishermen and hunters and indigenous people as they traveled the landscape. And then they built the mills there and everyone came there. When I was a kid growing up, I'm a Gen Xer, full disclosure. When I was a kid growing up in the 80s, I remember talking to folks eventually when I got to the university whose parents had grown up there, and they talked about how their parents, like right out of high school, could walk into the mill and get a job $60,000, $70,000. In the mid 80s, that was a pile of money. So the state of Maine bent over backwards to give them whatever they want. And 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, they gave them the West Branch. Here's the West Branch now. This is a picture out of a FERC document. I realize it's really confusing. You see Millinocket in the middle there. These different colored codes are sort of different pieces of the development, but basically 70% of all the riffle habitat in the West Branch is flooded. 70%. It also was the greatest salmon river in the state of Maine, the West Branch of the Penobscot. Probably the adult runs were in the tens of thousands just in the West Branch. It's all gone. Industrial pollution. I don't think we need to say more than that, right? The Clean Water Act was passed in the late 60s, I think. So that's what built these water treatment plants in municipalities and set up standards for discharge. Now you need a federal permit, state permit, things like that. But for years, that you just got dumped in. And still, if you look around the state of Maine closely enough, the things that are still getting dumped in our rivers, which are permitted, is still horrifying. Again, it's all about money, right? Our rivers took it in the net. Our rivers were a resource. They weren't our home watersheds. They were a resource. Again, Dan's narrative. All right. So the Penobscot River Restoration Project, right, was a big thing. That gentleman is Butch Phillips, and I hope this video is going to play. Butch Phillips is a Penobscot tribal elder. Pardon me, I get a little excited about this stuff. He's going to talk for just a couple minutes on what the restoration project meant to him. Now, Butch, I just saw him the other day. He's probably late 70s. He might be in his early 80s. I think he's in his early 80s. So he grew up in a different time. He's part of the silent generation, pre-baby boomer, right? Anyway, he grew up on the river at a different time, and he's going to speak to you about the restoration project and what it meant. This is at the head of Indian Island, looking upstream, and that's the rising sun in the east. Let's hope this works. Let's hope this works.
My ancestors traveled up and down this river literally thousands of years. And they gained all their necessities of life ultimately in the river. Going up in the 50s, there was no sea mud fish. Fish were blocked because of the dams over here. I always dreamed that someday the dams would be removed. But I never thought in my lifetime I would ever see dams being removed from the Penobscot River. Section being free flowing here. That's my ancestors experienced it. The Penobscot River Restoration Project is really a unique collaboration between an Indian tribe, 7 conservation groups, our company, federal government, and the state of Maine created this project that is beneficial to everyone, beneficial to our company, beneficial to municipalities, beneficial to fish, beneficial to the Penobscot Nation. This project is a dream come true for me. And I can't wait today that I see sea-run fish, which I call the refugees of the Penobscot River, return once again to their ancestral spawning ground and to our home, Penobscot Nation.
That's powerful stuff. All right. There's the Penobscot River watershed in the great state of Maine, in the indigenous homeland of the Penobscot Nation. Again, largest watershed completely within the bounds of the state of Maine, home of the Penobscot Nation. They've been trying to restore Atlantic salmon in the Penobscot River for 100 years. The first federal fish hatchery was built in the state of Maine. It was a salmon hatchery. It's still there today. It's been improved many times and rebuilt. Craig, bless you, the Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery. However, every other fish has been ignored really up until this point, unless it was a game fish, unless it was a recreational fishery for it. But as far as sea-run fish, the only one that counted for a long time was Atlantic salmon. Atlantic salmon have been listed as endangered in the state of Maine since 2001. That listing expanded to the Penobscot River in 2010. I was hired by the tribe in 2011. I started my career in 2001 when I first got listed, which was probably why a fisheries biologist coming out of the university was able to get a job in the state of Maine at that point in time, because they seem to be few and far between. However, that is the long list of sea-run fish that come up into the Penobscot River. I like that alewife is on the top. The thing about salmon biologists is they grow old and they become raging alcoholics and insane, and they talk to themselves. Alewife biologists grow fat and happy and they look like the Buddha. You throw 10,000 salmon in, you might get one back. You throw 2 alewives in, you get 10,000 back. It's a dramatic difference, dramatic difference. But we all get along as pals, right? Alewives and salmon did. So I learned a lot from my alewife partners. And once I became the tribal fish biologist, the manager of the program, I got out. I worked for the salmon program for the state of Maine for 10 years. Nothing but salmon, Atlantic salmon all the time, blinders on Atlantic salmon. But it's great to be able to work with so many species these days. All right, the Penobscot River Restoration Project. Oh yeah, boy, this is some real heavy narrative here. The largest, most creative river restoration projects in our nation's history. Now, that's probably not hyperbole, actually, although the Klamath is going to outdo it. The Elwha, what happened on the Elwha River out west, probably outdid it. But what happened was, and this happened just before I got to the tribe, the relicensing of a couple of dams was going to happen. If you look in this river that you see in the photograph is flowing north to south. Former VZ Dam, former Great Works Dam, and then the Milford Dam. Milford was coming up for relicensing, and the power company knew they may be on the hook to provide better passage. And they also knew that the Bureau of Indian Affairs may get involved and flex their 4E conditioning authority, which is part of the Federal Power Act, that says if you have a reservation, the federal government must act on the behalf of that reservation for why that reservation was created in order to protect it. The power company was fearful of that. So what they did was they brokered a deal. They said, well, what can we do to not fight? So, well, they decided to sit in a room and talk about it. And then they talked for about 10 years and brought lawyers in and that kind of thing. And eventually they crafted a deal that said, okay, if you give us $60 million, $30 million, we will sell you the lower 2 dams, hand them over to you. But you have to allow us to put turbines in on the Stillwater branch. See where it says Old Town in the map in the middle? That is an island. It's what they call Marsh Island. That's not a tribal word, by the way. It's called Marsh Island. The Stillwater branch is on the western side. The mainstem is on the eastern side. So the power company got to refurbish an old dam, install a new powerhouse. Then they got to build a brand new powerhouse at an existing dam. So they added 2 powerhouses of 2 dams on an endangered salmon river, which would never happen in modern times. However, it was part of a cooperative agreement, part of a settlement agreement. But they removed the mainstem dams. And the reason that the tribe and others were willing to do this, make this sacrifice, was because the prevailing wisdom said that the fish would go where the water is. The majority of the water goes in the mainstem. And that's how it all worked out. So those 2 dams were removed. Here's a couple of aerial shots, show the VZ Dam on the right-hand side of the screen. That was the first dam on the river. You can see the fishway in the middle of the jagged dam there. That was built in the 60s. A vertical slot fishway. Here's a cute story. In the entire history of that fishway, it passed about 10 shad, 11 shad. Wasn't built for them. It was built for salmon. Salmon are tough. Salmon will put their face into anything, and they're incredibly voracious swimmers who don't care who's beside them. American shad are a very different animal, very different. They want their brothers and sisters shoulder to shoulder, and they're afraid of shadows. They were afraid to go underneath bridges because of shadows, freak them out. This is, again, not hyperbole. This is true. Shad, you look at them wrong and they tip over and die. So anyway, this is what it looks like now. These beautiful rivers. In the bottom right-hand section, you see these berms in the middle. This is all cobble and boulder. They used to be these timber crib structures where they would boom logs back in the day, because both banks of the river, in both of those lower pictures, were sawmills back in the day. So those two dams were removed. Now we go upstream to one of the tributaries. The Penobscot River is above this photograph, flowing from the left to the right. This is the end of the Piscataquis River. Now you can see the dam that goes across, the old decrepit powerhouse in the middle, and then this big, looks like a blowout, like Hurricane Sandy came in and built this. That is a bypass channel. It's the greatest fishway I've ever seen. It is massive. It carries a huge amount of water. So this bypass channel was built around this dam to allow salmon and other sea-run fish to get into the Piscataquis River, which is a high-quality, cold water brook trout, salmon, eel sort of stream. This dam was purchased by the Penobscot River Restoration Trust. The locals would not allow them to remove it. There were 20 or 30 families who lived in the impoundment that went to town meetings and screamed bloody murder, threatened biologists with violence, and the town would not give the permit. So instead of paying $1 million to take the dam out, they spent $7 or $8 million to build this bypass channel around the side. Salmon restoration is not it's not science, it's a social experiment, and it's very important that we all remember that. Fish restoration, protection of endangered species is not science, it's a social experiment, and we're still experimenting today. There's a lot of subtleties that I didn't understand as a young person fresh out of the university that I appreciate more now. I don't appreciate it in the sense that I like it, but I appreciate it in that I understand it better. But the strategy in all places, right? Okay. So we're going to run through real quick and dirty some really cool stuff that I get to do, right? So while I'm not beating my face into the wall praying for justice for the Penobscot River, I get to go out on tribal land, fix things. Now, most of the state of Maine was logged, right? So anytime they came to a small stream, what would they do? They'd throw a bunch of logs in it, a ford, right? And then just drive over the top of it. As time went on, they said, well, let's put a culvert in there. They'd put in a culvert, dramatically undersized. The culvert would rot and fail, wash it out. So then they'd come in and add more fill and put a culvert on top of it, and then a culvert on top of it. And then eventually the little head pond behind the culvert gets bigger and bigger and bigger because the culvert is so far up, and there's 6 culverts down underneath it that have all failed. This is, I've seen this, it's remarkable. But if it exists on tribal land and I get to see it, oh, we're fixing it. And we go and do the right thing. We find where the stream bed is and put an arch culvert in or a bridge. So connectivity, habitat restoration. In addition to that, when the Penobscot River Restoration Project started, the first dam was removed in 2011, and the second dam was removed in 2013. The state of Maine started stocking alewives. That's what MDMR is, Maine Department of Marine Resources. They started stocking alewives in tribal waters in this subwatershed called Madamascontis Stream, which is in the Penobscot tongue means place of many alewives. Of course, why not start with your restoration there? And the tribe said, yes, please, we'd love to have that happen. So this is how this all got teed up. This is Madamascontis Stream in the background. So this block of land that you see here, there's the Penobscot River in the lower right-hand corner. This is upstream of Old Town. It doesn't matter how far upstream, but a good ways upstream. This sub-watershed here is really all of Madamascontis Stream. East Branch Lake in the upper left-hand corner actually drains in a separate tiny trib that goes down in a different direction. But Madamascontis, Little Madamascontis, and South Branch Lake all drain into Madamascontis Stream, which heads to the Penobscot River. The tribe owns this land in trust with the Department of Interior. So that means the tribe is able to harvest timber. The tribe is able to manage it how it wants to. The tribe does not pay taxes on it. It is held in trust with the Department of Interior. So this is traditional industrial logging forest. So when I started, none of these culverts had ever been replaced in the right way. And these are what we've done at least through 2019. Those little thumbtacks in the bottom right, those aren't my projects at all. But anyway, we've done a few more since 19. Okay, so this is what you find. This is low flow conditions, right? We didn't have low flow in 2023. The Madamasconas Lake is in the way background. You see the logs across the center. I'm standing on a bridge. Madamasconas stream flows from the top of the picture down. The timber crib structure that was at the outlet of the dam had failed. That structure was there to hold back water in the springtime. So all the logs that were ready to go downstream were held until everything melted in the spring, and then they'd open the gates and all the water would go at once, and they would flush the logs down to Bangor, which is a 2-hour drive by vehicle to get there, and a longer ride through this little stream. That structure had deteriorated. Now, instead of water flowing over the rocks in a nice defined channel, you had all this rubble, and the water was sieving through the rocks. So our little alewives, the little juvenile alewives that are 2 inches long, 3 inches long, they're trying to get to the ocean in the spring and in the late summer and the fall, they run into things like this. You can see the leaves on the trees are lightly yellow. This is late summer. So we built this. Now, this is the first one we did. I wouldn't do it again like this. However, I didn't design it. We had a fishway engineer design it. So basically, the idea was we were going to create this nice series of steps to allow the stream and the fish. You can see the center tongue of water. There's a low flow notch in the middle of these, but we built it too wide. We also didn't build it quite robust enough. And Mother Nature doesn't like things like that, and she will hand it back to you very quickly. So the upper 2 weirs failed. We had a lot of erosion. We had gravel and sediment coming in. But the juvenile alewives didn't care. They poured out of this lake, and the adults poured in, and they poured out, and they've been pouring in for several seasons. And it's wonderful. Now, if you look at the lower left-hand corner, this is a picture that was taken several years ago now. Right now, there's a lot of trees on the bank that have done this large woody debris addition that's happening. And people ask me, should we get in there and cut those out? I'm like, no, gosh, don't touch that. Leave that alone. It's beautiful. But it's a big mess. Like, no, it's supposed to be like that. Rivers love trees. They grow up together. So there you can see a little large woody debris. The channel has stabilized. I was there just the other day with Butch Phillips, a tribal elder. And it looked lovely. And we've had such a great water year in the state of Maine. East Branch Lake Outlet, same situation. There's a large berm that ran off to the left-hand side of the screen and continued a little bit to the right. Again, the end of the lake was clogged up with a berm and a timber crib structure to hold the water to flush logs in the 1850s or 1860s. Now that is crumbled, the stream is very tight and narrow. You've got a high gradient and really a velocity barrier because the water is ripping. Not a velocity barrier for salmon, and certainly at different flows, other fish could get in there. But in the spring, when our herring are coming in, this would be very challenging for them. So we built it a little bit differently. We made sure that the spacing was narrow to match the stream below it. We also put footer rocks underneath the weirs to make sure that high flows would not blow them out. This is directly after construction in an extremely low flow year, looking downstream. It looks horrible. It looks like riprap, or yeah, it still looks horrible. Today, it doesn't look so horrible. Here it is the next spring under high water conditions. You can see this nice, beautiful tapering thing. The uppermost weir is almost completely flooded. The second weir that you see in the middle of the screen, mostly flooded. I could swim up that. Okay, South Branch Lake Outlet. I don't even know, the lake is in the background. You see all the sticks? That our friend, the beavers like to do that because they saw that pipe there and they said, boy, this is a great opportunity. Like if I was ever going to build a dam, look at this confined little space. This is great, right? So there was a pile of rubble at the lake outlet here. Someone had put this water control structure in. I use air quotes because I'm not sure where they got the piece of pipe. Probably came out of a mill, probably was a part of an old furnace or something. And they would put boards in it. And then one landowner would come and say, oh, the lake's too high. And they'd rip boards out of it. And the next landowner would come down on their boat and say, oh, the lake's too low. And they'd stuff boards in it. And then the beavers would say, we don't care. We're just going to stuff debris in there. So I hope I have a better picture. Okay, there you can see it. You can see the pipe is clogged with beaver sticks. This is about a 3.5 to a 4 foot drop. This is very early spring. You see the grass is just starting to come out. Things are just starting to leaf out. Again, very challenging. You didn't have a defined flow defined zone of passage, right? It was leakage all over the place. This is a big site. So we decided to do a roughened channel with a low flow channel in the middle of it. The lake would be on the left-hand side. The stream is down on the lower right-hand side. A lot of partners here, massive project, hundreds of thousands of dollars, right after construction. Again, low flow fall, beautiful foliage, but it looks like a lunar landscape, right? You can't see any of this today. This was done in 17. This is completely vegged in. You see the mats along the edge of the woods there. That's where, you know, sort of some stabilization, all kinds of plantings of alders and things like that, all kinds of native vegetation. The idea is when the flows come up, because it's so rough, roughness is the key determining factor in velocity of water, more so than slope, roughness. So we had all this roughness here. So at high water conditions, it's hitting all these boulders. That's why white water is white water, because it's crashing into boulders and slowing down and dissipating energy. But in low flows, we get a nice trickle down the low flow channel. So here it is under high water the next spring. You could see any little black-nosed dace could slip up through there without any problem. Here's looking downstream, fully wetted, right? Fully wetted. Here it is midsummer, that first year. This is summer of 18, I think. The greens it's starting to grass up. Mother Nature hates a vacuum. You ever like clear out a spot of your flower garden and then leave it for like a half a day and all of a sudden there's weeds growing everywhere? It's the same everywhere. The seeds are in the ground and all they need is the opportunity. Oh boy, and then I saw this. July, which is really early to see out-migrating alewives, and these guys were tiny. They were like 1.25 inches. If you could see them over that rock, but they're everywhere, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And for the first time, who knows how long, these little fish had been spawned in the lake, and now we're able to get out of the lake when they wanted to in a nice, beautifully safe, natural sort of condition. Culverts and more culverts, right? This is another sort of map showing all these culverts that were identified by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as being impaired. So it's a great way. Oh, what are we doing on this one? Culverts. We've done so many of them at this point. So this is the picture on the lower right. I'm standing on the road looking upstream. That is some sort of decrepit beaver deceiver to keep things out of the culvert. But the culvert was totally rotted and crushed in on itself. Looked like this sort of thing. That doesn't look like fish passage to me. It doesn't look like aquatic organism passage to me. It looks like a mess. And it is a mess. High flows, the water would come over the road instead, wash out the gravel. And then what do? You add more gravel, right? That's the way it was done historically. So we like to do things like this, large arch culverts. This one is a little bit flooded because the beaver built a dam behind me. I'm looking upstream in this picture. But you can't fight the beavers. You just have to let them do their thing and try to stay out of their way and vice versa. Here's a low profile arch culvert. This one is made out of aluminum, but sometimes you can't build the road up so much and you need to keep the profile of the road low. So you put in these low profile arches. Here's looking upstream. What happened there? Why are all those dead trees there? Well, their roots were flooded for years because that culvert was in there. It was undersized and clogged. And so it killed them all. Dry kai, as they call it in Maine, dead. You see them at the end of lakes. From the lakes being flooded historically. And then look, you put the stream sort of back where it wants to go, everything starts to green up. This was taken a few years ago now, and it's even more lovely now, the way the softwood trees have come in there and started to shade the little stream. The stream is, and this year especially, the stream is finding its more defined channel, because for years it didn't know where it was. You see the effects of the glacier here, just dumping things all over the landscape, as it did in so much of the state of Maine. Look, there's my baby boy. This is a bridge. It's a classic Maine woods, timber-decked, hemlock-decked bridge. Originally, there was a box culvert here, a concrete box, that what they did was they poured a bunch of pea gravel in the stream and set the box on top of it. Doesn't make a lot of sense. The stream eventually went underneath that and was all clogged up and was sieving through the gravel. So this is one of the most beautiful brook trout streams you've ever seen. I mean, it's just stuck full of little teeny brookies. And underneath it, we put a couple of little, some little boulders to blend in with what was going above and below. You see the steel up underneath that bridge. So the steel will last forever. It's on concrete waste block abutments with the hemlock decking. The decking will last 15 years, and then you can replace that fairly inexpensively. But the steel and concrete will outlive all of us. This is one of my greatest pictures, right? So this had a blown out culvert. It was like 6 culverts on top of themselves. They were about this big, little teeny culverts. This is a beautiful little stream. Can't really see it in this picture, but it's sort of meandering its way up through the mud there. Again, it had been flooded for 100+ years. We went in, finally put a new culvert in. Okay, so this is spring of 19, before things have started to green up. Here it is at the end of the summer, or late summer. Now, right now, I was at this, bless you, I was at the site not too long ago. The alders have started to creep in from the forest. All this seed was there. We didn't seed anything. We just left it alone. And the seed was just there and it just has exploded. It's one of the most beautiful sites. These are the things that keep biologists like me like getting up in the morning. I should put this on my refrigerator, actually be like, look, Dan, you did it. It's even better today. Now go fight the good fight. Okay, partnerships, right? The tribe doesn't have an endless supply of money. The tribe doesn't have any money. Let's be honest, okay? Well, I'll be honest with you. So who do you partner with? Federal agencies, non-governmental organizations, anyone who's willing to work together. And that involves state agencies, federal agencies, from all aspects, engineering support, fisheries management, collaboration, and just outright funding. Ongoing challenges. All right, we're gonna have to go through this really fast. Okay, I'm gonna give you the quick and dirty ongoing challenges. Like, it all looks rosy, right? We pulled out a couple of dams, did a bunch of restoration projects. It's not, okay? Let's say the Penobscot River is a parking lot, right? Underneath is this beautiful garden. It used to be, let's say it was a meadow. We made it into a parking lot. What we did with the Penobscot Restoration Habit is we went into one little corner, we chipped away the asphalt, got rid of it. We did some nice plantings, and that little piece of meadow has come back. Meanwhile, the rest of it is a parking lot. So we have to be honest with ourselves. Now, I'm not trying to undersell it. It's better to have a little bit of meadow than zero, right? It's better to have some free-flowing aspects of the Penobscot River than zero, but we have got a long way to go. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They manage and license hydro dams. Let's look at their charter. They are an independent agency within the Department of Energy. FERC is independent of the Department of Energy political structure because FERC activities shall not be subject to further view by the Secretary of Energy or any other office or employee of the department. It participates in business oversight. I don't see the word fish or habitat or clean water anywhere in that. Yet FERC, hydro dams are the biggest, #1 major negative to the systems in the East Coast, and certainly in the state of Maine, New Hampshire, in Massachusetts. The biggest negative, and they're still there. Don't think that they're green for a moment. I don't think that they're green. Anytime they put green energy in some of their narrative, I instantly call them on it and say, it's not green. That belongs on your website, not in a federal document. Okay, you need to pull it out. Let's be serious. I could rant about FERC for days. Okay, Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, the agency that handles recreational fishing in the state of Maine. You see any native fish there? I don't. God, I sure don't. Splake. Anyone know what a splake is? Okay, so there's one. In a laboratory, some very clever fisheries biologist said, boy, what if we cross brook trout and lake trout? What do we get? Now, they didn't cross for 12,000 years. They didn't do that. Let's try it. Let's force it. See what happens. Maybe they'll be sterile, won't breed. Maybe they'll grow well. Maybe people like to fish for them. Maybe we'll stock them by the thousands for decades. All of these fish are protected in the state of Maine. All of them are protected in the state of Maine. Actually, when I was coming through one of your towns locally, I saw a rainbow trout on one of those signs out front. I just wanted to stop in and go, hey, that's a filthy Western fish. Brown trout, European fish, right? Splake, laboratory fish, smallmouth and largemouth, Ohio River Basin, New York, northern pike. Northern pike are not too far away from us, actually. They're up north. People love them. They were never here traditionally, but they're all protected in the state of Maine. A big report came out by the tribes in Maine that said the greatest threat to indigenous species recovery, sea-run fish recovery, is introduced species, not exotic. We're not talking about snakeheads from Eurasia. We're talking about these guys managed actively for recreational fisheries. hard thing to work against. Maine hatchery systems. Every year, IFNW approve 1 million brook trout. No, there's a native fish, brown trout. Lake trout, I like those. Lake, rainbow trout, landlocked salmon. And why do they do that? To maintain healthy populations. If you read in the small print, it goes, well, where there isn't enough habitat to support them. So it's really a put and take fishery. 2, to provide opportunities to anglers. Priorities out of whack. Number 3, to boost our state's economy. Oh God, I love that. I get very upset at this. I go to Augusta and rail at these people all the time because these objectives and the tribal goals are diametrically opposed. Native fish restoration to indigenous lands, recreational fishing, selling licenses. The two don't mix very well and we don't get along all the time, but I try to be cordial. Brookfield Renewable Power Company, Canadian. They own 90+% of all the hydro dams in Maine. Do they care about our native fish runs? No, they care about their stockholders. I get it. If I was a business owner, I would do the same thing. But these are the impediments. I'm not making a moral judgment on right or wrong, just telling you the facts as a native fish restoration practitioner. We don't have time. These are just, this is heartbreaking stuff. Oh God. Okay, see the top left of this picture, the 5 little vertical windows? That's downstream passage. See the 4 large windows underneath it? That's the intakes to the turbines. Can you guess when they tag fish and put them through the system where they go? They all go through the turbines, and they've done it since 1984. And you know what FERC has done in the meantime? Squadouche, which is an old Scottish term, means 0. Anyway, all right, let's look at some good things. Bottom right picture. God, this is terrible. Let's just say when I started my career, there were 13,000 alewives in the Penobscot River captured at a fishway. This year we had over 5 million. Okay, that's in a very short amount of time. That's in a decade. Massive jump. We had 13 shad in the history of the VZ Dam. We had 7,000 in 22 and about 4,000 last year. That's because of all the spill at the dam. They didn't catch them, but there's more in there. So there are very good things happening. Here's the flows 2022 versus 2023. Anyone who was in the woods at all this year or even lived in New England knows that we had the highest water year in record. Here's our little alewives. So we're going to end on a good note, and then we're going to have a little Q&A. Oh, look at those little happy fish coming out of tribal land into Madamascanta Stream, the place of many alewives. That's good stuff. Thank you to all these folks, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service, Maine Department of Marine Resources, Atlantic Salmon Federation, the Nature Conservancies, Penobscot River Restoration Trust. Special thanks to Chief Francis, Chuck Loring, my current supervisor, and my mentor, Mr. John Banks. This is what I get to look at during the summertime as I sit on the porch at camp in St. Albans. That's a happy place. All right, thanks, everybody.
Dan, how much input do you have into the engineering design of the restoration projects now versus when you started?
I have more now because I understand them better. So when it first started, a lot of those structures were built by sort of the last class of federal engineers, right? The more modern class of engineers who are coming up through have really been trained to think about not only from the technical aspects, but also from a river ecology, from a geomorphology point of view. So they're really, like Dave Ross kind of stuff, really looking at what the river is above and what it is below and trying to make it as natural as possible and as stable as possible. So oftentimes my input would be more of culverts. That's not something I really play with. They ask me, Dan, how wide do you want it? I'm like, well, 1.2 bankfuls, what everyone likes. Let's go 2 bankfuls just to be safe. I'm glad we did, for this season. So I do get a little bit more now, and that's because I understand it a little bit better. So, thanks.
The Damascata fish ladder, I think it's really interesting. Do you think that is a positive thing? Does the Penobscot have the fish ladder? This for the alewives?
Yeah, Damascata is one of the oldest alewife runs in the country, really, and they built that a long time ago. It's an interesting ladder. If you ever get to see it, it's all this pool and weir structure. The pools are built out of cobblestone, and it really is the focal point. I think it's really cool, and I hope that, they do a harvest there, and they smoke alewives, and they do a festival, and they bring people out. It's really a textbook for the way a community should engage to show off their fish runs, and we're seeing that explode all over the state. Most of the restoration of alewives in the state of Maine came from people going to Dan McCaw, the state of Maine, when I say people, with trucks and going, well, let's take a few thousand out of here and move them over here. And so Dan McCaw really was the seed stock for the Penobscot and Kennebec groups.
The question from a student here, and then we'll have a question on Zoom. Were you raising your hand?
Yeah, sorry. I had it.
Oh,
Okay, do you think protecting the non-native fish is something that's helpful, or do you think it's more detrimental to the fish that are actually native to the rivers?
I would say it's detrimental. It's a negative. Ultimately, when fish species mix, right, probably when the glacier receded and the crust of the earth was pushed down as far as it was, there was a great deal of mixing. Like there was a lot of, and this comes from my reading and my own guesses on how it would have happened. So it was a great deal of mixing. As the crust rebounded and these rivers settled and the glacier was fully melted and these rivers became more stable, then the competition happened, right? And these fish competed with each other for thousands of years, and some of them just won, right? That's why we have brook trout here. We don't have them in Florida, right? Because the temperatures were right for them. That's why we have Atlantic salmon here, but really didn't get them much south of like Long Island Sound. Now in the modern day, we'll take global warming out or climate change out of the picture. When you introduce that species, oftentimes the native species is already impaired because the habitat is so broken. Now you're introducing an exotic or an introduced species, which is non-native, into a system that is already impaired, and it fills a niche that's vacant at that point in time. So they explode. Like if you look at smallmouth bass in the state of Maine, they're everywhere. So over time, and if the temperatures remain the same, we do more restoration, the native species will begin to outcompete them, I think. But in the meantime, when we are prioritizing the protection of those fish and not really caring about the restoration of other fish like the sea run fish, it's challenging to justify protecting those introduced species. It's a great question.
so the question in the chat, I think is kind of, we could see as a follow-up, which is if they didn't stock the non-native fish, would they die out?
In some places, yes. In some places, no. Smallmouth bass are not stocked. Largemouth bass are not stocked. Black crappie are not stocked, but they do very well because they're occupying a niche of an indigenous fish that is no longer there. Splake would die out, definitely. Brown trout would have to compete with brook trout and Atlantic salmon, and we'd see how that goes. They could make a foothold in small places, but they're outgunned. So yes and no.
Yeah. Thanks. Go ahead.
When we engineer the streams or culverts to like make it healthier, how long would you say like the whole process takes?
Would you repeat the question for Zoom?
Yeah, the question was, when you do stream restoration projects like culverts and bridges, how long does the process take? Normally, year one would be a survey, right? You'd go out there and do a total station survey and take all these points in a longitudinal profile and cross sections to get an idea on what the stream looks like above and below. Then that information would be taken back and the engineers would grind that out and sort of figure out, okay, where does this bridge need to sit? What does the orientation need to be? Or where's the culvert going to sit? Normally that would take place over the next winter to the next spring to create the design. And then construction would happen the next year or the year after. So normally 3 years is about right. 2 would be a very rushed timeline, but 3 to maybe 4 years. Right now, the construction business in Maine is so backlogged that it will take normally about 4 years from survey to design to bidding, contracting, and construction. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a specific like time of year or season that you'd like to start those restoration projects because of like the flow rates or the fish that might?
Yeah, most of the time the survey work is done in the low flow period. So you think of like late June through late September. Because, well, then you can get in the water a little bit easier. A lot of times that is pushed towards the fall. So you get some of the dropping of leaves like right now or in the month of September. So that's when the original surveys were done. Construction has always happened in the low flow period, so thinking the end of June through the end of September. And the idea is that you have less impact on the water and less water to deal with, because a lot of these sites you have to pump water around or divert water around your site as you do your construction. So yeah,
I put one thing about that, if you take into two things, actually. One is, when is the spawning season? You want to stay out of that when you're messing around with that kind of stuff.
yeah.
And the other thing is, you may want to electrofish, build impoundments and electrofish out of the area where the bridge is going to go under construction and move them through part of the stream for a while.
Absolutely. So you'd set up these blocking seines on either side, upstream and downstream, clear the fish out of there. And especially if you're talking about endangered species like Atlantic salmon, you'd want to get them, and that would be all part of the permit to get those fish out of there. That's a great point. Somebody done this? Go ahead. So the question was, are there currently other restoration projects happening in other states that are of that size? And when you mean that size, do you mean like big river, large dam removals? Well, the Plymouth River in Northern California, Southern Oregon, they're talking about removing three mainstem dams out there, and that's going to be one of the biggest projects in our country's history as far as removing big mainstem dams. I don't know of other big mainstem dams that are being removed or scheduled to be removed in New England. I hope they're happening, and I think what's happening is there's a lot of small ones happening all over the place, all over the place. Yes, sir.
When you remove a dam, is there a tremendous amount of silt that ends up washing down the stream, and is that a consideration you have to deal with?
It is. It is. With the two dams in the mainstem Penobscot River, a lot of times, so that's good. So what happens is, as these dams exist over time, the head pond behind them, because it's this area where the water sort of slows down, a lot of the sediment will fall out. And so it becomes stacked up behind the dam. Unless there are toxic sediments in there, and they can do some borings and core samples to find out what is in there. A lot of times, it is always considered. But in my experience, a lot of times when these dams are removed, the flow rates or the flow that comes down through, normally in a couple of years, well, the first season, it would blow it all out. And then in the downstream end, where a lot of that gets deposited, in a couple of years, that will continue to scour and deposit and scour and deposit. The dam on the lower Sandy River, which is a Kennebec River tributary, it's not very big, the Sandy River. Probably summertime flows would be 300-400 CFS, high rain event, 5,000 or 6,000 CFS. So not terribly big. When the lower dam was removed, we had surveyed down below the dam before for habitat. We came back the next season and there was gravel everywhere. I mean, everywhere around every boulder, the gravel had just inundated it. We went back a few years later and the gravel was all gone because it just couldn't stand it. Now the river had all that power to put it back to that state of equilibrium. But it is always a consideration, especially if there's toxins in it.
Can you talk a little bit about the perspective of the people of the Penobscot Nation, the indigenous perspective, how their priorities for this sort of work? Do they align fully with like conservation groups? Are they different? Are they sort of aligned? Sort of from your perspective, what do you know about that?
A lot of times they're very much aligned. The idea of free-flowing conditions, flows, following the natural hydrograph, sort of as Mother Nature would determine what that looks like. There are very few times where, and at least in my career, at least where the conservation community, Trout Unlimited, Atlantic Salmon Federation, the Nature Conservancy, Natural Resource Council of Maine, folks like that are really in the restoration conservation business. It's very seldom that the goals of the tribe that I have seen are not aligned. It's always that subtlety, because your goal may be here, but where you end up is somewhere in the middle between the present state or the untouched state and where you are. But I think there's a lot of, not deference, but there's a lot of respect in those groups for the tribal opinion to say, how does the tribe feel about this project? What would the tribe like to see, and how does this fit with your goals? And then a lot of that is easy for those groups to say, look, the tribe feels this way, we're with them on this. And a lot of times those are really in lockstep. So I suppose there are times when it happens where they don't agree, but I think, at least in my experience, it's been really easy and very similar.
So there's a question in the chat that gets to these, that's thinking about some of these social sides as well. So the question says, given that you said restoration is a social experiment rather than science, do you think we're missing any major components by employing natural channel Roskin design? I assume you know what that word means.
Sure.
Are you making anecdotal changes from project to project, or purely relying on engineering design and planning using technology such as river morph?
There's a lot in that.
Yeah, yeah, you can read it too.
Okay, restoration is a social experiment, yes. What I meant by that is sort of Atlantic salmon restoration, or so not the restoration of the landscape, but restoration of that species, which of course is tied to the landscape. Do you think we're missing major components by employing channel design? Well, I think Roskin is just one of the tools, and you talk about river morph as well as another tool. Most of the time in these restoration processes, there's a group of different experts from different fields. So you have your fluvial geomorphologists, your hydrologists. Now, hydrologists is a very specialized science. This hydraulic modeling is extremely precise based on 100 years of stream flow data, right? But now we've got this changing patterns of precipitation. Then you've got the engineering perspective, not only the hard engineering perspective, like classic sort of engineering, civil engineering perspective, but now you bring in this idea of those engineers being sort of schooled in more than just straight engineering, like how much can concrete stand, or how tall can we build a concrete wall, and things like that. So I think even though it's a socials experiment, it's all based on hard science. Now, the social aspect really comes in when you start making priorities, right? Every one of us in this room is carrying a battery-operated time travel computer in their hands, right? I've got mine right over there, okay? We all have it. We all soak up and suck up electricity. Think of the electricity in this room right now. Like, if you don't have to go back too far, and there was no electricity, okay? It doesn't, like the history of man. This is a snapshot, this is a blip, this is a modern thing. Electricity in the Northeast comes from hydro dams most often, and now we see solar farms and things like that. And I'm not going to say what energy policy should or shouldn't be, except that they should rip out all the hydro dams. But I'm a fish guy, right? I'm a fish biologist. I would gladly give up my cell phone and hang it on the wall in the kitchen. Gladly, if they'd rip out the hydro dam in my town. But that's where the social aspect comes in. Hydro dams are viewed as clean energy, right? It's not belching black, dirty, cold smoke and dust into the atmosphere in order to produce electricity. It's a social experiment. What are people in the United States, in New England, willing to sacrifice for the creatures that live in that river in their backyard who can't speak for themselves? And I'm not talking about the fish, we're talking about whole ecosystems, right? That are massively affected when you cut off migration patterns, seasonally, daily. So that's where the social aspect comes in, balancing those needs, because most people, they go to work in the morning. Now, pre-pandemic, it was more typical. They'd go to work in the morning, right? They'd stop at McDonald's or Dunkin' Donuts on their way through. They'd get a coffee. They'd go to work. They'd do their thing. They'd go out to lunch. They come home at night. They feed the kids. They turn on the television. They go to bed. On the weekend, they go to a movie. Maybe. People go to the movies anymore? But the disconnect between the natural world and the American lifestyle is massive, massive disconnect. That's where us Gen Xers have failed. And that's where the millennials and the next generation after that, the next generation of that, hopefully will get back to it and realize that the time that we spend out in the world is really important. But right now we're on that cusp, that technological mountaintop. And so that's where that social experiment comes in. So thanks. That's a great question.
Yeah, well, and he said thanks. The answer is in multidisciplinary examination. So it sounds like you and the question asker are on the same page there, that it's not one way of looking at any of these questions.
No, and fisheries biologists don't run the world, right?
Yeah.
Wow. I'd like to be around when that happens. That'd be interesting. That'd be an interesting thing.
Was there a question? Did you have a question? I feel like
I just wanted to mention too that, just to underscore your example of where the property owners held up the removal of the dam up in Maine. We had same situation here in Hampshire. And a small quick take river down in southern New Hampshire called the Salpini. We had approvals from just about everybody. It's probably their project. Help from other organizations as well to remove the bill from the dam. But it got to the state, the town meeting, and the property owners around the lake that was formed by the dam, it came and shut it down because they didn't want to use the lake property.
Right. And that's a very common story. And those people aren't necessarily wrong. They're more than they're welcome to say what they think should happen in their own backyard. In my view, in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, all those people are going to be dead. Okay, the generations turn over very quickly, very quickly. Like, how did I get to be 50? It's scary how fast it happens. So I think as we as people who care about the environment, and I think that I hope we're all lumped into that one general care class or bowl. You have to think beyond that, right? Think of the way the Penobscot Nation would think 7 generations out. Great grandchildren. What do we want to leave for them? But again, fish guy, total fish nut. So.
All right. There's one other question in the chat. We're approaching overtime, but and you started to touch on this in your previous response, but the question is really about how or if are you engineering your restoration projects for a changing climate?
Right. I think one thing that we're seeing in the Northeast is bigger storms, more water all at once, right? 3 and 4 inch rainstorms in a very short amount of time. I've seen it in my time, and you've probably all seen it in your time, especially the last few years. It just seems to be getting more intense, right? So these bridges, these culverts, these projects, they all have to take that into account. The 100-year flood event is now happening every 3 or 4 years, right? So these numbers are being pushed. We've got 100 years of flow data, and the last 15 years are really starting to skew that whole data set. So when you think about 1.2 bankful width for a project, to allow that stream to do its own thing, you really have to start thinking even bigger and bigger than that. And a lot of the models that we were building on before are all changing very quickly because of these events. So yeah, you have to keep that in mind. Now, is that the climate change, or is that the Gulf Stream acting up or falling apart? It's many things, but no matter what label you put on it, the data is real, and so we all need to be looking for that. The intensity of these storm events is real.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. I want to thank you all for coming again. And this is the second of 4 events this semester that are all sponsored by National Endowment for the Humanities Spotlight on the Humanities in Sustainability Studies grant. That was a lot of a sentence.